Good morning, Ashley. How are you?
Good morning, Jamie. I'm doing great. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good. It's good to connect from London to Brooklyn, I think you're in, yeah?
That's correct. And I guess
Yeah,
it's not morning there, is it?
no, no. Afternoon. It's still daylight though. The days are getting a little bit longer, so I'm not recording in the dark yet.
Thrilled for that.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join this series of Sentientist conversations. And as you know already, I guess it's a series of conversations about what I think of as the two biggest philosophical questions. The first question being, what's real? How should we understand the universe best? And the second question, just as important, who matters and what matters? The questions of ethics. And I have an obvious agenda because I'm trying to persuade 8 billion humans to agree with me that sentientism is the right worldview to apply to those things, that takes a naturalistic approach to thinking about what's real and what's true, using evidence and reason. And when it comes to questions of ethics, it says that every sentient being should warrant our moral consideration, should get our compassion. So any being that can suffer, flourish, or experience things at all. But I'm talking in these conversations with people whether they agree or disagree with that worldview. So it'll be fascinating to understand your perspective and what that means for how we can try and make a better future. But before we get onto those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work?
Well, first of all, I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. But my background is that I am a director at PETA. I've been with PETA for over 16 years now. And the bulk of my work over that time has focused on campaigns and media, doing everything from organizing and executing really eye-catching, media-friendly publicity stunt protests that PETA is known for, to working on our celebrity campaigns, and just a whole wide variety of other things. I think one of the great things about PETA is that whatever it is that you do, you can pretty quickly be thrown into something absolutely unrelated. We're a very all hands on deck organization. So basically, I've just been working for PETA in all capacities for 16 years now, and enjoying every minute of it.
Yeah, brilliant. But it's very clear you're not sort of sitting quietly in head office. You're out there on the front lines running campaigns and doing outreach and getting directly and personally involved in all this stuff as well as organizing it. So, yeah.
Very much so. Very hands-on, very, very out there, speaking to the public and speaking to the media and bringing the message to the world.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, we'll come back to that in the final question we ask, of course. So before we get there, let's start with these big philosophical questions. The first one being this what's real or what's true question. So for many of my guests, it's a story about whether they grew up originally in quite a sort of naturalistic, scientifically minded, maybe atheistic sort of context, or one that was maybe more mystical, spiritual, religious in some sense, and how that side of their thinking's changed over their life, if it has, and where they've got to so far. So I'd love to hear your sort of philosophical journey so far on those questions.
My upbringing and my background in terms of religious life was interesting because I grew up. I was raised in the Christian faith, but in a sect of it that's very spiritual and also scientific. The way I was brought up was that there was never a divide between, well, this is science and this is God, and they're incompatible, and this is spirituality. It was all very much something that was compatible, and that was all that was all part of the philosophy.
Yeah,
of how
so it's quite integrated. Yeah,
right, exactly, yes. And
what was the name of it? Does the group or the
so it was the Christian Science Church.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, which basically it just, again, there was just a lot of spirituality. And I should also say that this was, my on my mom's side, several generations on my mom's side going back. And then my father was raised like a practicing Catholic or,
Yeah.
I mean, it's like he'd been raised Catholic, but wasn't involved, in that anymore, and was not, was not a religious person, but was very supportive of my mother's relationship with that part of her life.
Yeah.
So it was just, again, it was a very I was able to see this relationship between my parents, one from a religious background and one really not. And the fact that they had no friction about it whatsoever and that they respected each other. And so very early on, it was just, and the thing is, the church that I was raised in, the idea was very much that you had a personal, spiritual relationship with God, and that then that influenced your relationship to the world. But it was very much about you and that relationship. It wasn't about, well, look outward and, judge what other people are doing based on this philosophy. It was, this is your relationship and your way of identifying spiritually with the world. And it's very unique. It's unique to you. It's unique to,
So does that mean it was, as you said, it was more about your own journey and your own place and less about maybe judging others or
absolutely
what to do in the world? But does that also mean it wasn't sort of intermediated by the institutions quite so much? So, in some other organizations, it's more mediated through your relationship with the church, and church has the relationship with God, or in Catholicism, it goes through the Pope and then up, right? There's a chain of command. Whereas it sounds like this was much more, direct personal relationship. Yeah.
Yes, actually, the philosophy was always actually that if someone's telling you that you need someone or something, some institution, some person to have a spiritual relationship with, whatever you want to say, God, with, that's wrong, that you should be questioning that. It was very much, at the end of the day, you can be without a church, without religious leaders, without books, whatever. You should be able to connect always directly with the spiritual part of your life. There should be no barrier between you and again, we would say God, but I always, that word carries a lot of baggage with it. And I think that, that the idea of God that I was being presented with was something very spiritual, as opposed to, this kind of very judgmental human figure. It was a very, spiritual idea. And so,
and when it was presented in that sort of spiritual sense, did it still feel like a personality or a consciousness, or was it sort of more diffuse than that? Was it more the sort of universe as a whole, or some other more transcendent thing, but not an individual with a personality taking decisions and judging?
Oh yeah, no, it was actually very, very oriented towards moving away from that, towards, the idea that we kind of tend to want to, assign a human personality to, it's like and I think we can talk about this with animals too. We judge everything based on this human worldview, and we put this human worldview and we assign value to things based on that. And this was more, get away from that idea of this human personality and into an idea of universal love, universal spirituality, universal,
So instead of it being the sort of, God is, or man is made, and it's always man, right? Man is made in the image of God, which is really just an excuse to make God in the image of man. It was breaking away from that, and it was thinking about it in a broader spiritual sort of universal love sense, rather than it being
very much so.
An old man with a beard sitting in a cloud. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. And to me, it was absolutely all about taking it out of that context and putting it in a spiritual, accessible, universally accessible. And again, the idea that, that there was no one, that it wasn't like, well, people who believe this and ascribe to this are, things are going to be good for them and then bad for everyone else or anything like that. It was just this idea that, there are these universal There's universal love, there's, and it's available to everyone. But again, but not, but that doesn't mean that you get to tell anyone else how, how to interact with that. It's just that, so it was a very, I guess I would just say that it was an upbringing that told you, that didn't tell you what to think. It was more about a discussion of how you could think and perceive things, but not telling you what to do in your human life. Like,
it wasn't sort of prescriptive in that way. It wasn't so much here's the rules and you have to follow them, otherwise bad things will happen.
Exactly. It was more just like, well, here are these tools that you can bring with you into your interaction with the world to be more loving, to be more, to think on a more macro level, and not just, to think on a more enlarged and spiritual and, about bigger truths, and not just, not just sort of, I guess I would just say to think bigger.
Yeah, and the integration of scientific worldview is really interesting. So obviously that doesn't happen in all religious ways of thinking. So I'm really lucky to be able to give classes and workshops with kids in schools about different worldviews and philosophies. And sometimes that is a really obvious opposition. So, I'll be talking about, for example, a humanistic or a sentientist or a naturalistic way of thinking generally. And people will be like, well, where did the universe come from? And where did humanity come from? And these questions, which put in opposition a religious worldview where they've been told, the earth is, and the universe indeed is 6,000 years old. And evolution is not how these things came to be. They were placed in the earth by a deity. So there's a real sort of conflict. There are two worldviews here. There's the religious thing we're told that we're not to question, and then there's a scientific worldview that we might use in our everyday lives like everybody else does. But, if the two have to battle, it's clear that science has to lose, and evolution and 13.8 billion year universe and all that stuff, unfortunately, has to go out the window, whatever the evidence is. So I'm interested in how the Christian Science way of thinking integrated those things, because in a way it's reasonably easy. You can either have a sort of scientific worldview over here, but then say, but there's also this transcendent spiritual layer, and you can also split the methods you use sometimes as well. So you can say, well, in this domain of human thought, we use evidence and reason and scientific ways of thinking. But here, when we're thinking about the spirit, it is a different way of thinking, a different way of believing. But I should stop talking. I'm interested in how, were there clashes, the science and the religion, and what was the mode of thought that they used to try and handle those things?
I mean, it's interesting because I guess, first of all, in I think primarily it was never even in terms of it being integrated. I mean, it almost wasn't. It was more just like this, this is, there was just never an idea that those two things could not exist compatibly. And it wasn't like, okay, here, this is how you rationalize this. It was just, I guess to me, I never really understood the idea that people could believe in this all powerful deity or force or, creating power, but then couldn't believe that all powerful presence would have created these scientific things. I guess, I don't know, it just never, and I'm not saying that I don't want to, again, speak for, the religion or the church, because, I'm not, I'm not a spokesperson for that. But I guess to me, the way I was raised, I never saw any incompatibility, because also I, was raised seeing the Bible as, I guess I should have said this before, it's just a very spiritual interpretation of the Bible. I was raised with like, this is a book where, we get you interpret it spiritually and you take away these spiritual ideas. So it wasn't put in front of me like, okay, well, this is where you go to learn. Like,
it's not literally, this is the word of God and you have to, yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't like, okay, like Adam and Eve. This is, you know, you need to learn this as like the, you know, science of how humanity start, you know, it was just like, there are spiritual ideas that you can take from, you know, from what's in here. So it just wasn't, there was no, you know, there was just no conflict there. And then in terms of, I mean, it's always been interesting to me that, you know, within that church and within that religion, there are a lot of scientists, there are a lot of physicists who, you know, just, and just a lot of, who like give talks and lectures and write articles and things like that. So again, it just this whole cultural conflict between, you know, the idea of God and the idea of science, it wasn't part of the landscape. It never occurred to me that those two things could or should be incompatible, until obviously later, you know, when I was older and I was exposed to, you know, to the world and exposed to the fact that, you know, that there was a lot of religious antagonism out there towards, you know, the scientific community.
Yeah. So it sounds like something that as a child you were quite comfortable with and on board with, and it felt like it fitted.
Yeah.
Is that still true now, or have things shifted, or?
No, it is. Yeah. It's still definitely very much a part of my life.
So you consider, you call yourself a Christian Scientist now?
Yeah, I do. And, you know, and again, I don't, you know, I don't want to like say that
you're not a spokesperson.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you know, I think that, I wouldn't say that I like speak for the church or anything like that, but I mean, just, you know, but spiritually, I really still do identify with, you know, with these ideas and these values of, you know, again, just so many of the things that I mentioned before, of just, you know, just universal spiritual, or I guess I would say these like macro spiritual concepts of, you know, of love, of spiritual ideas that that kind of bring us out of what's right in front of us.
Yeah.
Which the thing is, again, I think like to me, that's so compatible with scientific thought, because isn't so much of science trying to like go bigger and deeper than just like just accepting what's right in front of you and not trying to think any further? I mean, isn't science about really trying to like get bigger and understand things from, you know, from a bigger philosophy? Like I guess, I've never seen conflict there.
I think there's plenty of commonality there, and you can sometimes feel it in the language as well, because I think some people will use the term spirituality in a sense where they actually mean they think there is, you know, a spirit, and there is a deity, and there is something physically that's beyond the natural world, if you like. And others will use those words of spirituality and even words like soul, but actually be in a very scientific way of thinking. They're just thinking about the fact that, you know, we are all connected through physics and through recognizing their sort of emotional sense of connection and a sense of awe and wonder. So I think there can be quite a lot of overlap between a sort of, you know, supernatural spiritual way of thinking, if you like, and a sort of open-hearted, open-minded scientific way of thinking. I think there's quite a lot of common ground there.
I think a lot of the things that we've sort of been inclined to put in this like supernatural category, and I think that this gets into animals very much, are actual, you know, I think sometimes we call things supernatural because we don't understand them, you know, and then there is science behind them, but it's science that we just don't understand yet. And I think we saw this hundreds of years ago where, you know, we would call something witchcraft and there was actually like a reason for it, you know, and I think with animals very often, I think there are so many things to us that are mystical about animals, and there is science behind it. It's just science that we are just starting to understand, or that we don't yet understand, or that we just don't respect. You know, I think in terms of things, you know,
science we haven't got to yet.
Exactly. Things that animals sense that we don't sense, capabilities that they have that we just don't respect. They're actually very significant. So again, to me, I just, you know, I think sometimes there's a human instinct to label things supernatural when maybe they are very natural and very scientific. We're just not there yet.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is one of the things that's interesting about this sort of topic, because in a way there's two different ways of using the term natural and supernatural. So one is, I'm not a philosopher, but I think, the formal term is a sort of ontological way of thinking, which is, what is real? Is the natural world all that exists, or are there supernatural things? And people will normally talk about gods and spirits and ghosts and so on. So it's like there's the natural world, and which do you think is right to believe in? But the more interesting bit, I think, is the epistemology, which is how do we go about choosing and what to believe, and that's the evidence and reason in Sentientism. So in a way, that's not saying the supernatural doesn't exist. It's just saying we should use evidence and reasoning to work out what might be true. But we should do that in a radically open-minded way. And I think that partly leads me to it's exactly the observation you were saying, in that, in a sense, we might label something as supernatural because we don't yet understand it. Now, it's possible that thing just doesn't exist, and we've just made a mistake, and that happens a lot too. Or that it's wishful thinking, or it's just something we'd like to believe is true, and it's just not there. But quite often, like you say, it's maybe some science we haven't got to yet, or we haven't understood yet. But as we get better evidence of it, then that is part of the natural world, right? It's not a supernatural thing. It is a real thing that we can gather evidence of from, our senses and from our scientific instruments and from our intuitions. Well, then it becomes part of the natural world. It's no longer supernatural at all.
Right.
Yeah. So they do seem to sort of collapse down in a sense. And the natural world can have a lot of really weird stuff in it, right? Really weird.
Exactly.
You look at modern physics, the natural world isn't just things that intuitively make sense to an average-sized human ape, right? And our savannah evolved intuitions. I mean, modern science is deeply weird. So the natural world can include weird stuff too. So, but I'm interested in, because there's at least two ways that people can hold a spiritual belief or a more classical theistic belief in a God. And one is to say, look, I don't need evidence and reason here. I have faith. I don't need evidence and reason. In fact, I can disregard the evidence and the reasoning because I have this faith. It can be a feeling, it can be a choice, it can be something else. So that's one way of having that type of supernatural belief. But the other one is to say, well, no, I'm with you, Jamie, on the evidence and reasoning, but my evidence and my reasoning has led me to believe that these things exist, and it might be a God, or it might be a spiritual world, or it might be a sense of transcendence. Which side of that do you fall in? Are you more of a faith person, or are you more my evidence shows me that this spiritual sense of connection and the Christian Science stuff, I think that's true because of the evidence?
I'm the latter.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And again, part of what I was raised with was that if these philosophies can't, if they couldn't prove themselves, if they couldn't show up for themselves, then, no, you wouldn't go along with them. You wouldn't believe them. But yes, I'm definitely very much, on the evidence.
Yeah. And this might be a tricky question to ask, and maybe it's a bit cheeky, but can you imagine there being evidence that makes you change your mind about those things? Can you imagine learning something about the universe or the world that leads you to say, actually, on reflection, I don't think the Christian Science way of thinking is accurate, and my beliefs about spirituality are, I'm going to move away from them. Can you imagine that, or does it feel too alien?
Well, I guess the thing is that I see this less as, if it was in my life as like, okay, this is this XYZ thing that I, believe by, then then of course, there's always this openness to learning something new. I would almost say that it's more of a spiritual practice in many ways. And so, as you practice anything, you evolve, you evolve with it. It evolves with you. So does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
It's not something that's static to me. It's something that, that has grown and evolved with me throughout my life, and I expect it to continue.
And it also feels like it's something that's, because it's very open for you, it also has a flexibility built into it that means that you could interpret it in a bunch of different ways too, right? It is this sense of the spiritual, it is this sense of universal love and compassion And it sounds like it's not particularly prescriptive in terms of like rules of ethics and things that might have that really hard-edged implications for your life. So it's sort of easier for it to shift and accommodate a broadly scientific picture of the world anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and again, this is me, but like, and obviously I think with any religion, there are certain, there are certain basics. There are certain, there's the thou shalt not kill, which I think, things
yeah,
like
that's one of the good commandments. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think there are certain things where, yes, most religions would say, well, yeah, this is kind of you should probably be practicing this. But yes, in terms of generally, this is, in my experience of this background, I've always been told to take things, take things back to, again, to God, to my spiritual life. And so again, it's just, it's, you're basically, the idea is that you're supposed to be like growing and evolving and understanding more and pursuing that greater understanding. And so I don't ever see myself being in a place where I am not inclined to keep pursuing a greater understanding of the world spiritually, of the universe spiritually, of truth, of all of these things. I think that, I think that's just compatible with who I am to want to do those things.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And if it's a way of thinking that feels compatible with the scientific worldview for you, and it's not blocking you or pushing you into any sort of difficult ethics, why would it's difficult to imagine a situation where you'd feel the need to reject it or turn away from it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. To me, spirituality, it is a scientific pursuit,
Yeah.
I think that I think too often our ideas of science are too limited. I think we should be able to interpret the entire universe, all of reality through scientific methods. So
yeah. And it's fascinating. Thank you. And the it's interesting because when many of my guests are sort of boring, straight down the line naturalist atheists like me, but many of them have either a religious worldview or a spiritual but not religious worldview or something in that space. And there's two, I guess, questions that we ask when I ask when sort of examining that. One is, can there be epistemological problems because you've got a dogma that stops you from understanding reality well? And in this case, it doesn't feel like you do because you've retained a completely sort of scientific way of understanding the world and you're open to new evidence. So that's really, it's not so much of a problem. Whereas in some other religions, it really can be. Some of the kids I was talking to last week are explicitly struggling to get through their biology class because it clashes viciously with what their parents have told them. So that's much less of an issue in this type of way of thinking. The other challenge can be, as we come on to this second question about what matters and ethics, can be where supernatural religious ways of thinking can warp or twist compassionate ethics. So you don't have to look too far across religious worldviews to find examples of whether it's anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever it is, right? And whether some people might argue, well, those are baked into the core of this religion. Others will say, well, no, it's a perversion of the original compassion of the religion because normally powerful men have sort of put their own medieval ethics into these institutions and, look where we are now. But again, I get the sense from the Christian Science sort of influenced worldview you grew up in that you didn't really see any of those sort of ethical issues that came through in your childhood or as you grew up in that church or its way of thinking as well. Is that a fair thing to say? Because it was quite open, it was about universal love, and it was less about prescriptive rules that might discriminate or harm.
Right. Yes. I mean, and again, this was my experience of it. This is my experience of it. And yeah, and again, it was very, very much about, if you're questioning something, if there's something that, if you have an ethical question about the world, you should be going back and, working it out according to these spiritual tools that you have and addressing things that way. And it's actually interesting because oh, hello. my kitty, I heard something. um, Maybe she'll come visit us.
Say hello from me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Extra guests are welcome.
Sweetie. So I grew up in Los Angeles, and I you know, I went to a handful of different private schools when I was growing up. And at one point, I think she wants to come up. At one point, I did go to to a school that my parents at one point had to put me in a new school like halfway through the year, having to do with like we had moved and and they ended up enrolling me for just the end of one semester in 8th grade in a Southern Baptist school. It was very, very, very different than the philosophy that I had been raised with, and
both Christian but worlds apart. Yeah,
worlds apart. They actually had pamphlets in the office that like told you why basically every other religion in the world was wrong and sinful, and mine was in there.
Oh, really? And you were like universal love, and they were like, "You're going to hell."
Yeah, no, yeah, definitely.
Ouch.
And the thing is, my parents very much like when they very much told me, because the thing is, it was 8th grade. It was the end of 8th grade, and after that, I was going to be starting a new school, high school, in 9th grade, and so they straight up with me. They were like, look, we just need to like put you, we just need you to be in a school for the end of the year. They were like, we know that you have a very strong sense of it was just, they were like, we know you know what you believe. We're not worried about you, being influenced here. Like, just we need you to just get through the end of the
few
year
months
someplace, and this is like the least complicated, the easiest, the most straightforward way of doing this, and then you're going to start high school at your next school. There was never any like even a moment of concern on their part, on my part, anything, but in an anthropological experiment kind of way, it was very interesting for me because it was just a world of difference again from what I was raised with. I mean, it was interesting because this is literally a Southern Baptist school. Like everyone who founded it, ran it, etc., had like picked up from, hello, baby,
hello there.
from the middle of, Tennessee, and come to Los Angeles. I guess to save the many very sinful souls in LA. And it was, and again, not, no disrespect to anyone if that's if that's their world, but to me, this was something pretty culturally shocking. And I just remember, and so they you had chapel every day, and you had like Bible study, and and I was getting this very different view on things from them, and I would ask questions, and I remember that I was constantly being told, "Be quiet, sit down, stop asking questions." I remember the word "obey" was used a lot. I remember like teachers literally just saying, obey, like just like nothing along with it, just be quiet, obey. And I didn't get it. I was like, if this is how you understand the world, why can't you answer these questions? Like, why can't you explain these things? And I think until then, I had just taken it for granted that, okay, well, if you have a religious or spiritual philosophy, like, of course you're going to ask questions. Like, that's what you do. You ask questions, and if there's not already sort of a universally agreed upon answer for these questions, you're going to be told, like, go, take what you have and work it out, take the tools you've been given and work it out, but no, it was very much like, here's, at this school, at this particular school, this particular practice of that religious faith, the way it was run by a family. The way this family did things was, here it is. Here are the beliefs. Believe them, abide by them, or go to hell. If you don't understand them, stop questioning. Like, stop questioning, stop asking, shut up.
Yeah. And that's a pretty stark dissonance against the world you've grown up with. And it seems to combine some of those problematic elements we touched on before. Right? One is the unquestionable dogma. Here is the answer, and you're not allowed to ask questions. One is the unquestioning, obeying authority, right? And this sort of hierarchical view of, you are in your place, I'm in my place, and you have to obey without question, which often is an echo of the relationship that religious sect has with its deity.
Right. Very true. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the retribution, right? The idea that a compassionate God could condemn billions to eternal torment seems somehow dissonant for me, but for them, this is just the way things are. So,
right.
Which can also warp what you think compassion can even mean, I think, because if that's one of the most insidious things about the idea is if you think a compassionate God could genuinely create hell, what does that really mean for what we should do when we feel compassionate?
Very good point. And also just what occurred to me at the time was that, it's living with so much fear, with just constant fear.
And for some people, it's actively traumatic, I think. It is
yeah, absolutely. And
understandably, it would be if I believed that stuff.
Oh my God, if I from the time I was a child was told that, that I could very easily make a few mistakes and burn in hell, I would be really stressed.
Yeah, you should be frightened. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say, like, also, I would make the point that, now at this stage of my life, I have, I have friends of, across the spectrum of religious beliefs, of, just from atheists to, to people from just every kind of background. And I absolutely just, respect everyone's individual, relationship with that part of their life. But I definitely, again, just being in that atmosphere for me, I just remember being really struck by the fact that it seemed like you were not allowed to ask questions. And again, by just the constant, fear and control. And it seemed, at the very least, again, in this practice, in this execution of this, in this, in the way that this particular institution that I was attending was, it seemed like it did a lot more for the people in charge than it did, it was, it basically sort of seemed to play to their interests, because they were able to just kind of have absolute control over this congregation and these kids, and because there was a church that went along with the school, and just demand this unquestioning allegiance, and yeah, I'm grateful that I experienced this, because it helped me understand, first of all, why there, in a lot of cases, there's such a very strong reaction against religion, because I think that if I had grown up with that as what I understood, church or religion or whatever to be, I would feel very differently.
Yeah. You might even be an angry atheist now, who knows?
Very much so. Yeah. I think I would have a very different relationship with all of this. And so I think it also helped me understand, I think it helped me understand maybe what the experience of people who are, who are living their lives in these religions is a bit more, in terms of, it just, I think it's, I think it was helpful for me understanding a lot of different parts of society and religion better, because I think that my experience, my background might not be the norm,
Yeah. And I think that's one thing I agree on absolutely is I'm fully in favor of freedom of belief and a sort of secular approach that allows people to find their own way, religious, spiritual, or otherwise. At the same time, not letting that freedom make us shy about being really clear when there are harms and oppressions being done in the name of those ways of thinking. We can still be crystal clear about that stuff, but that doesn't mean you have to necessarily throw the baby out with the bathwater or insist that everybody has to be an atheist, right? So I think that's one angle. And the other thing I think is that is really interesting, because you have that experience of at least learning about one other religion, is that I think it was great for kids to learn about all sorts of different worldviews, religious and not, because it may or may not change your own particular worldview, but just understanding the others exist is an amazing sort of mind and brain and eye-opening exercise in understanding the diversity of human opinions and ways of thinking. But let me come back to your sort of ethics, and we're moving properly into this second big question of what matters and who matters. And for many people with a religious or a spiritual way of thinking, it comes as part of that package, and it sounds like yours did too. And there is this sense of universal love and compassion that comes through Christian scientific way of thinking. So I'm sort of guessing that that's one of the foundations of how you think about ethics and good and bad and right and wrong. But is that the starting point, or how would you describe the foundations of your ethics, if there are such a thing? What do good and bad, right and wrong actually mean to you at a basic level?
It's interesting because obviously, yes, I was raised, in this, so that certainly had a great deal to do with my foundations. But again, my father was not religious, not affiliated with any church, and my father had a profound impact on me in terms of being just an extremely ethical, thoughtful, just brilliant person. And so I think my parents really laid the foundation, for my sense of ethics, each coming from their respective backgrounds.
And that's an interesting lesson in its own right, and that you don't need an old book, written in the however many hundreds of years ago to give you an ethical framework like your father.
Right.
You can be a good person, right? Yeah.
Well, and even again, remember, because I was raised in the church, but the church was telling me too.
Same thing, yeah.
That these, that there are these ideas of universal good, and that's not, that's not limited to us. That's not limited to our books. That's not limited to our church. That's, that's bigger than us. That's, and so, exactly. I was very fortunate to be raised by two extremely ethical, thoughtful, kind, intelligent people. And so, so I think that, I would say I would look to my parents in terms of where these things came from. And again, so I think so much of that is, it's being taught values, but it's also being taught just a way of approaching the world, because, no one's going to be able to tell you everything right off the bat. No one's going to be able to know everything that you'll encounter and say, okay, this is how you handle each of these things. So much of it is instilling, a way of approaching the world and approaching, a moral dilemma and,
that's important in its own right. It's not looking for a perfect answer. There's going to be work and exploration and uncertainty in that process. Yeah.
So having the foundation,
And I think I know the answer to this question already, but one of the other things I'll sometimes ask people with a religious worldview is, do you do good and do you feel compassion for others because of those others? Or do you feel compassion and love for others because God tells you to do it? Which is not really a fair question to ask. But there is a sense in some religious ways of thinking that ultimately, and I think the technical name for it is divine command theory, is that the reason we have to be good is because God tells us to be good. And I don't get any of that sense from you, or that it would come through.
That was never. Never part of my teaching or thinking. It was I
You
would
do
say
good
that.
because it's intrinsically good.
Right. Yeah. Goodness is something much more primal than that.
Yeah.
I think for me. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I thought that was going to be the answer, but it's interesting to explore. But the other part of this question is one of who matters, because I think many people would agree with you and me that, ethics and morality about being good, and being good means ultimately caring about, if not loving, others. And how could anyone disagree? But then when you can start to ask questions about, okay, which others, then you start to find some interesting breakpoints. So there are some humans, as we know, even today, that will clearly, feel that compassion for their in-group. But when it comes to out-group humans, they might think in a very different way. And of course, the default human value system might grant, for example, universal human rights, as in the Declaration. At least in theory. We know we're a million miles away from putting that into practice, but at least in theory, many humans around the world would say, of course, all humans warrant moral consideration and compassion and rights, but they'd struggle to go beyond that. They might care about their companion animals or selective charismatic wild animals, for example, but really struggle to go beyond that. So I'm interested in your journey on that who matters question, and how that was influenced by your Christian Science worldview, and where you've got to now on that question of our moral scope. How far should we care, and who should we care about?
Well, I mean, it's a big question. So, but I guess starting for me, starting as far back as I think these ideas and teachings started. I grew up in an animal loving household, and we had animals, and they were unquestionably family members. And it was just, I feel like it never even had to be explained to me. It was just in the way that we interacted with them. Obviously, these animals are part of our family. And I grew up, probably before I could put any of these ideas into words or really coherent thoughts. I mean, for instance, my parents had a dog who they'd had for several years before I was born. And, before I even thought to really analyze it, she loved me and I loved her. And that, just in the same childlike way that I knew my parents loved me and I loved them, this dog loved me. And I mean, my mom always she loved me before I was born. When my mother got pregnant, this dog, she got stacked. It's like she had a sympathy pregnancy. and then my mom always said people thought I was this pregnant woman walking a pregnant dog. But it was just, she identified so much. And she got viciously protective of my mom at that point too. Like they had to actually, I think she actually attacked the mailman once, and it was the whole thing. She just, this dog loved me, and I knew that.
What was her name?
Bloomingdale, because when they got her, they were living in New York, and Bloomingdale's is the famous department store.
So it could have been Macy's, but they went for
right,
Bloomingdale.
Exactly. But so I just that I had these. Just very early on, it was not something I even thought to question. Just, we had it. We had animals. We loved them. They loved us. And, my parents very clearly were always taking them and their feelings into consideration. And, there were those early lessons like we had a cat who my mom had for many years, long before I came along. And I think I was always drawn towards animals and fascinated with animals, and I loved them. And, I think maybe he was not always quite as appreciative as the dog of some of my attention. And so, I think there were some early lessons there in my mom, telling me, okay, well, we love the cat, but so this is how we treat Oedipus in a way that's, that makes him that's respectful to what he wants.
They have their own perspective. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. He loves you, but he doesn't want to play with you in the same way that the dog might want to, play with you. So there was just never any idea that these weren't individuals and that their individual needs and just shouldn't be respected. It was just a part of life.
Yeah, and I think that's it's a reasonably common sort of experience for young people growing up, particularly with animals that they can see, that they're sharing their families with. It's just blindingly obvious. What journey did you go on to sort of extending that recognition beyond the animals that you shared your family with and beyond the ones that you could see and interact with? What was that process like?
Well, I just loved animals, like always, just all of them. And I remember so clearly being very young. I mean, I want to say just maybe a few years old, like 4 years old, something, and being at the dinner table with my mom and dad. And I think we were eating chicken. And I asked, like, why is this called chicken when those, the animals are called chicken? Like, why is that called the same thing? And as an adult, I can kind of process now. I remember this like pause. It was like this pause and this like, oh shit
moment.
Yeah. And I put it together later. It was the same pause and like look that my dad got, a few years later when I was like, someone at school said Santa Claus isn't real, but that's not true. Is it? And so, there was like this. Oh, and the thing is, my mom had actually been vegetarian years before for a while. Like, like when she first met my dad, I think she was a vegetarian. And then, later she started, she wasn't vegetarian anymore, but she always leaned a little more in that direction in terms, she probably naturally leaned more pescatarian if she was just doing her own thing. Whereas my dad was like red meat and potatoes, steak and pot roast, and
Yeah, it's not a meal without.
Right. Yeah. Like he was a, like a meaty guy. And so, but again, these, like so many, these were people who cared very much about animals and wanted me to like love and respect animals, but, just they're, they were still doing what most people are doing in terms of eating animals and wearing them. And, anyway, so there was this like, and when they told me that meat was made of animals, I was not happy. I was very unhappy. And basically, the way they addressed that with me was they said, there are people who don't eat animals and they're called vegetarians. And actually this friend of yours from school, her family is vegetarian. And they said, and someday if you want to do that, you can. They were just like, they basically were like, if at some point you decide that this is not, that this is important to you. But they kind of just put it to me as like, when you're older, you'll make this decision for yourself. And my parents were always very respectful and very like, they talked to me like I was an adult when I was a child. And so, so I tended to respect them because they respected me. And so when they put it to me like that, I was like, I wasn't thrilled, but I was like, okay, all right. But, so that was in there at that point. And then over time, I think when I got maybe about junior high age and, started to become a little more independent in the different ways that you do it at that age. I remember there were a lot of times when I would sort of start thinking about that. And I would say, I don't think I should eat meat anymore. I'm going to be a vegetarian. But without fail, that, it sounds so ridiculous to me now, but I would forget. It's like, I would go a day or two and I wouldn't eat meat. And then I would go out with my friends and we'd be at McDonald's and I would just order the chicken nuggets. I just wasn't even thinking, it just wasn't,
the default is strong, isn't it? It's just an attractor that you just get drawn to. Yeah.
It is. And then, basically fast forward, a couple of years. And one interesting thing that I'll put in here, because of the nature of the discussion that we're having, is that when I was, I want to say about 16, again, the older I got, the more these things kind of started to bother me. And, just the incompatibility of how I felt about animals and the fact that I was eating them. Although I always kind of told myself, you know what, there must be, I always just sort of was like, I'm sure these farms are very nice. I'm sure, I didn't think about it too deeply, but anytime I thought about where they came from, I would envision something very nice. And the other part of it was,
like in the adverts.
Yeah. And I would always kind of tell myself, well, there must be something different. There must be something different about these animals who we're eating. I mean, I like if I,
because otherwise we wouldn't be doing this, right?
Exactly.
Good people wouldn't be doing this. So there must be a reason.
Yeah. I was always, and the thing is, like, anytime I met any sort of animal, I would feel like a pull towards them. I would identify with them, but I always thought there must be, something. We wouldn't be doing this if chickens felt pain, if whatever. I mean, and the thing is, talk about your departure from science. I mean, but really there was always just something where I was like, well, clearly, we wouldn't be doing this if it was just so like cruel and violent and wrong. So when I was about 16, I was actually in Sunday school. And I remember asking, my Sunday school teacher, who was wonderful. I just remember saying, how do we reconcile like this philosophy of thou shalt not kill and the idea that it's wrong to kill with the fact that we eat animals? Like, how is that right? And, again, to her credit, there are a lot of answers that people get when they ask these things in a religious setting. God says it's okay, whatever.
Dominion or whatever.
Yeah. And she said that take that back to God. She just basically said, like, take that and address it spiritually and find your answer, find your answer with these tools and understandings that you have. Go apply that to this and figure it out. And she said it in a very loving way, not dismissive, not like, basically like when you have a question like this, like this is why you've been given these, these, I say tools for working things out. So go, go work it out, go listen, go ask, go. And so I was like, so I did a little bit and, would kind of think about it here and there, but it's not like I made it like the grand question of my life. I kind of just, every now and then. And within a year or two, I ended up being exposed to horrific footage that changed my entire life on the spot. And that was, I snuck into this, horrible film called Faces of Death, with my boyfriend at the time. I think, we were like 17 or something. And I don't know what I was doing there because it literally doesn't sound like anything I would ever want to see. But, he was just like, oh, there's this X-rated movie, like, it's supposed to be really, really gross. Like, let's sneak in, whatever. And so, because you couldn't get in if you were 17, I think you had to be 18. Anyway, like it was set up as like, okay, well here, this is real footage of people dying. And again, nothing I would ever actually want to see, but, the idea, there was this sort of mythological thing about these Faces of Death movies, and everyone was like, they're so clearly fake that it's funny. You watch and it's so obviously fake footage. Like you won't feel bad because it's, it's like watching one of the cheesy horror movies from the 70s. So I went in to see that. What I didn't realize was that there was going to be footage of animals dying. And I could tell myself that this footage of the people was fake, but I knew that the footage of animals was real because I knew that they didn't need to fake that, because I knew that animals were killed for us to eat them.
Yeah, there's an industry that does it. So
exactly, there was no reason to fake that. And so when they started showing footage of animals being slaughtered for food, it was really horrific. And it was the reality behind that, like, you know, me sort of thinking, oh, it can't be that bad. Well, it was 10 times worse. It was terrible. And then there's a scene in the one that I saw where, you know, you see these little puppies running around in a little pen in a kitchen. And you see a woman like chopping vegetables and she's like working at the stove and, you know, whatever. And the narrator starts talking about how these eventually she starts picking up the puppies, slashing them with a knife, skinning them alive, throwing them into this boiling water. It was one of the worst. It was at that point in my life, it was probably the worst thing I had ever seen. And the narrator starts to explain that, well, this is another country, and this may be really shocking and awful, you know, to a lot of people, but in this country, it's culturally no different to eat these dogs than it would be to eat a chicken or a cow or a pig or a fish in the United States or in the UK, or, you know, and he said, and I was, the thing is, as this is going on, I can't describe the level of devastation that I was feeling. I just had never felt such, first of all, hatred towards someone who I, you know, just a random person. I just thought this was the most evil person I had ever seen in my life. And these puppies were so obviously in pain, screaming. It was, and I had grown up my entire life with dogs. Like you know, it was like watching someone kill a member of my family, you know, or someone who could be a member of my family, and cook them. And he basically said, you know, well, we may think this is different, but, you know, the fact is it's only a cultural difference. There's no scientific difference. He was like, you know, these animals really, like, there's no difference in their ability to feel fear or pain. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, you know, what I said because it was a long time ago, but he basically said there's no scientific reason why it's wrong to eat a dog, but okay to eat a chicken. It's entirely cultural. And then he said, and so when I was a little uncomfortable with this at first, but once I rationalized that, I just thought, well, you know, and I sat down and had dinner with them. And everything in me was like, no, you can't rationalize this. There's no excuse for this. I may not have grown up with chickens, but I grew up with dogs, and I know that they feel fear, they feel pain, they feel love, they feel the whole range of everything. And I can't accept that this is okay. And so the only logical step for me was, okay, fine, I'll accept that there's no scientific difference, but I will not accept that it's okay to kill and eat a dog. So I guess that means it's not okay to kill and eat, you know, any of these animals, because no. And that time it stuck.
Because there are almost, you know, there's only two consistent choices.
Yeah.
and most people, of course, are quite happy being inconsistent. But one is, if your culture says it's normal, then it's okay, whatever it is, regardless of the harm caused. And the other one is, it's all wrong. And you took that second path, right? It's that simple.
Because the thing is, again, this was so extreme. It was so devastating. I didn't feel normal or okay again after seeing that for weeks. Like, yeah. I couldn't
properly traumatized. Yeah.
Yeah, properly and rightfully.
Yeah,
because honestly,
as you should be. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, you know, and I mean, every instance of that is just of what we do to animals, and, you know, justify in a million different ways. It should be traumatic. It's horrifying. But so basically it stuck. That's what it took to make it stick. And
that stuck. How quickly did you run that through to some of the other slightly less obvious stuff? Because clearly when there's flesh on the plate, it's pretty obvious, right? It's a piece of the victim. So that leads many people, including me, to vegetarianism. And I was stuck in vegetarianism for a long while. And then when you start thinking more broadly about the harm and death that's being caused, even if the body isn't on my plate, whether it's, eggs and dairy and so on, or whether it's clothing products and so on, how was, because my process of getting to those stages was embarrassingly decades long, but how quickly did you work through that stuff?
Well, it all started to become evident pretty quickly. It was a waterfall, because the thing is, like, and again, to my mom's credit, like when I came home and made this declaration, that this time I was absolutely not eating animals anymore. She gave me the book Diet for a New America by John Robbins, and said, well, then you should read this. And she had actually been trying to get me to read it for years. My mom is, just very fascinating and forward thinking about these things. And at this point, she's someone who, I'd say, she's not all the way there, but she's largely 80% vegan, let's say that. But yeah, so she gave me that book, and reading that book really quickly, he exposes the dairy industry, exposes the egg, and, he talks about all of it and just our philosophies in terms of, using animals in general. And so all of that started to influence me very heavily. And I also, I was, just in the punk scene when I was, in high school and after. And the thing is, like, once I was kind of scratching that surface, there was a lot really in, with a lot of the bands that I liked. I actually started realizing a lot of them were vegetarian, a lot of them were vegan, and a lot of these there were a lot of zines. I started ordering like punk zines that would talk about veganism, that would talk about vivisection, that would talk about all these things.
It's quite a strong link with straight edge culture as well, isn't there?
Yeah. And I definitely for a while I was, aligned with that, with this sort of straight edge culture yeah. So
have you seen the new Moby film yet? You must.
Oh my, no, it's on my list. Have you watched it?
I've just started, but I haven't watched the whole thing yet.
Really
but
excited.
It was a total eye opener for me, because I think 3 of my previous guests have talked about this. One of them was the sociologist Paul Pendergrass, and he basically said punk was my gateway to veganism. That is his way in. And another researcher, Christoph Don, he's a brilliant academic in this space about the psychology and the sociology of human, non-human animal interactions. Again, the punk scene was one of his formative things of getting into the non-human animal ethics space. So yeah, it's fascinating to hear that was part of your journey.
I think it's integral, because the thing is, for a number of reasons. First of all, again, because as soon as I started looking for this information, and this was the 90s, this wasn't, now you hear about these things and you can just go Google them. But back then you actually had to kind of seek out information,
It's more like flyers at a gig or...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, again, for me, a lot of that was ordering zines. Like, I would order these zines and there was all this information in there. So I think, the punk scene was just integral to educating me about these things. But then also, I think first of all, being part of this, this scene that was all about living your ethics, living your values, actually taking these things you believed and expressing them and living them in your life. I think that made a huge difference. So often people talk about how a lot of the challenge for them is not feeling like they have a community that supports them. Well, this punk community, it was absolutely supported. It was all about, live your values. So
the other thing that I heard recently, which I thought was fascinating, was that part of the ethos of punk was rebelling against standard high school rebelliousness. So it was like we're going to rebel against that boring. There's a rebelliousness which is about getting a keg and getting drunk and dressing in a particular way, and or being a jock or whatever it was. It's like we're going to rebel against that rebelliousness, and so it sort of fits. It fits with the sort of vegan ethic of the whole world is going one way, and we're going to do what we think is right. And, like, as you say, live the ethics.
100%. And I had always had a very rebellious streak, and this sort of, it gave a context to it. It was like, okay, this is what, yes, you're rebelling against the bigger status quo. You're rebelling against these people who are sort of, mimicking rebellion in a way that just is destructive. It was real, and so over the course of about a year, I went vegan. Like, and yeah, it was like it sort of just evolved as I and it was, I remember so clearly too that like vegetarian, I mean, I always say I didn't stop eating these things because I didn't like them. I definitely did. And I was not happy about the idea of giving up, steak and giving up McDonald's and all these things. But being vegetarian, I was like, yeah, I felt like I could do that and still, enjoy what I was eating, enjoy my life, whatever. I will never forget, again, this is very shortly after I had kind of made the switch, and I was still reading Diet for New America that my mom had given me. And I remember getting to the part about the dairy industry. So clearly, I was on a plane. My brother and I were going to meet my dad, across the country somewhere. My father lived in London when I was in high school, but he was traveling constantly, and so at this point he had traveled to the US for, some meetings, and we on the East Coast, and we were going to meet him. And I remember being on this plane and reading this book, and I got to the part about the dairy industry, and it was, damn it, I'm going to have to go vegan? Like, what? Yeah. I was so bummed. I was so unhappy. I was like,
you're so proud of yourself for going vegetarian, and then you suddenly realize, And
then I was just like, oh no, like this is not what I was after. Like, I was so bummed. And it's like we got to the hotel, my brother ordered like mozzarella sticks from room service, and I was like, French fries. I mean, not that I went vegan right then and there. Again, it was a process over the next several months. It was a very different world.
Oh yeah, it's getting easier all the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's brilliant. Thank you. And just to round out this question about who gets to matter, I have this weird thing where I'm sort of obsessed with this idea of sentience because everything comes back to it for me, but other people disagree. Do you think sentience is a useful concept in thinking about who gets to matter, this idea of who can suffer, who can flourish, who can experience things? Or do you think of that inclusion in a different way? Do you think of animals or living things or some other concept that may be informed or not by your spirituality that helps you think about who gets to matter when we're working out what's right and wrong to do, what's right and wrong?
It's very useful because I think our default should be that everyone matters. I think our default should be that everyone and everything matters. Our default should be to assume, to care. Our default should be to care and to respect and to assume that everyone matters. And I think that sentience comes into play by helping us decide how we act on that. It just by the idea that, okay, so because it's not intelligence, if it was just intelligence, then it would be, okay to eat someone with a low IQ,
Yeah. Look out, babies.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not, I think that, I feel like our default should be always to care and to just assume, that everyone and everything matters. And then I think that sentience should help us guide how we can do the very least amount of harm and cause the least amount of suffering in our execution of that philosophy. You know,
that makes sense. And I tend to have quite a strict view about this sentiocentric way of thinking, in that I think ultimately all value comes back to the experiences of sentient beings. So the reason I care about the rest of the planet and ecosystems and everything else is because of their impact on sentient beings. But even for people who have a broader scope than that, and as you said, sort of ultimately we should care about everything, I'd sort of agree with that, right? I wouldn't break a rock just for no reason. But there is a clear dividing line for me between, I don't think breaking a rock would be morally wrong, whereas, killing a pig, I think would, because the rock doesn't care about itself.
Totally.
The pig cares about itself and its experiences and its life, and that's the grounding of my morals. So I like that way of putting it. We can care about everything, but there's something distinct about sentient beings because they have their own experiences that means the way we care about them needs to be different. It needs to be a different level of, that's where morality really kicks in for me.
Right. Well, I think that's a great way to put it. And it's like care as the default. But as you said, I mean, no, like I exactly, a rock and a pig are very different.
Yeah.
But in terms of, I think that you touched on something very important there, which is that, that a rock may not be sentient, but if you're going out into nature and you're smashing a rock for no reason, well, that you're in an ecosystem that does impact sentient beings. And you're in, and I don't, obviously as we move through the world, yes, we will disturb things. We will step on, things will be displaced. I mean, we're allowed to exist. And I don't think that, that we should feel exactly that we should feel bad about walking on the concrete. That's not what I'm saying when I say that, like, everything matters. But I guess I would just say that I almost feel like there's this impulse out there that I see so often that's like, it's almost like, what can we not care about? What can we hurt? Like, tell me how low I have to go before I can start hurting and killing. And it's like, should default be the other way? Shouldn't our default be like, what is the most that I can do to not be causing harm? And it's very strange to me. And I seem to encounter it again and again. It's like,
tell me what I can destroy, please.
Exactly.
What is going on in your head? Yeah.
What is that destructive impulse? I mean, that's just very strange to me. And
that's a brilliant way of putting it.
Yeah, it needs to be flipped.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, so we've answered what's real and how to understand reality. We've answered what matters and who matters. So this final question, how can we make a better future? We could spend all day on this as well, of course, right? So I'm interested in your sort of whether you have a big picture view of how we can make a better world. And this isn't just about the animal question, it's about us human animals too. So whether there's something about, how do we make change happen, theory of change, levers you can pull, different modes of activism. So I'm interested in that. I'm obviously very interested in how your own work and your own campaigns and PETA's work feeds into that. And I'd be interested in, the views some people have of PETA's pretty bold, unafraid campaigning approach and how that works. And what do you think of the criticisms? But I know you're also working specifically on the Dress Vegan campaign as well. So I'll let you take it wherever you like. How do we make a better world?
I love that question because I literally, it's not an exaggeration to say that I think about that constantly. I feel like I start my day thinking about that. I think about it throughout my day.
It gets you up in the morning. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, and I think my whole, the whole of my work is really dedicated to that. And I feel extraordinarily fortunate to be able to dedicate the majority of my time to, again, what I see as making a better world. So I guess, first of all, to answer that on, this larger level, I think we make a better world by exactly what we were just talking about. I think that is the fundamental first part of it. Just caring more. That sounds a little trite, but I think actually, I guess when I say that, I don't just mean thinking nice thoughts about caring. I mean caring more and acting on it. I think we make a better world by taking that approach of not what's the most that I can get away with, but what is the best and kindest and most respectful way that I can conduct my life. And the thing is, I don't think that is restrictive. I really don't. I think that, we're not living on that, that desert island that people love to threaten vegans with.
Yeah. It's you or the chicken.
We're living in this modern world where we just have an abundance of choices, and we have so much in terms of technology. We have so much that allows us to make these better decisions, whether you're talking about animals or really, just in general. We have a lot of choices. We have a lot of options. And so I think that, first of all, as individuals and it really needs to happen, obviously, on a larger level as well. Approaching, instead of with that, like, what is the absolute most that we can consume and destroy, instead of approaching just in terms of, just a more thoughtful and more respectful worldview.
And I love that, because you're right. I can sense almost the hesitation, because it can feel a bit embarrassing to say just sort of, peace and love is what we need, right? And people are like, yeah, they'll roll their eyes. But in a sense, that's part of the idea behind this sentientism worldview thing. It's not changing a particular thing here or there, or changing this industry or changing that. It is a recognition that, whether we like it or not, humans have enormous power, nearly all of it.
Yeah.
Humans take choices based on their worldviews, and their worldviews are things like those values. Do we care, and who do we care about? And if those are broken or undermined or wrong, terrible things happen, right? So fine, it might seem sort of trite and obvious, but it's absolutely foundational, right? Is that compassion and putting it into practice. And the other point I also really like, right, because these things in the modern world often aren't sacrifices. They're actually things that would be good for us, even from a completely selfish, anthropocentric point of view as well. It's like, well, oh my God, why? Yeah. Anyway.
Absolutely, 100%. And that's, in some ways, that goes back to a spiritual place for me of like, well, actually, wow, when you do start to, live in this way that is more kind and thoughtful and compassionate, it actually does have a lot of benefits to yourself.
Isn't it convenient that we live in a world where it proves to be evolutionarily adaptive to be cooperative and compassionate?
Right?
I just hope that continues to be the case, right?
But, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I can see where that might lead you back into a spiritual world, way of thinking. Like, isn't it convenient that being good can be good for you?
Yeah, it's like you do these things, because they seem like the right things to do, and then suddenly you realize you're benefiting in all of these ways that might not have been, the original. And then on a macro level, look at the environment, for instance. I mean, just again, these choices that I would say are ethically right if you're taking into account sentience, et cetera, also happen to be the choices that are, that might save the world from being destroyed.
Yeah, which would be a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, we want a planet to live on. Hey.
Yeah. But so I think we share that view that this sort of human worldviews and values are deeply important. It's almost like the root cause of these problems. But as we've hinted at already, just sort of rationally talking to people and saying, let's be better, doesn't seem to work that well, right? So in that context, we quite often end up in this part of the conversation recognizing that, we sort of know the answer, and if only everybody else would agree, then most of the world's problems would be solved. And we could end there. The problem really, though, is in human psychology and human social norms that constrain and warp those compassionate values as well. So in a way, those are the things we're really working to change. It's not the answer, which is frankly bloody obvious. We're working on human psychology and social norms and institutional inertia and political will and so on. So that brings me on to the second part of the question about, okay, given those problems, how do we pull those levers, modes of activism, institutional personal change? How do you think about all of that stuff, and how does your work at PETA fit into that?
Well, I think there's no one way. I mean, obviously, when you're talking about, an issue on that scale, it takes a lot. It takes a lot of different approaches. It takes a lot of different, different kinds of activism, different kinds of work. It takes a lot. So I think that's, the first thing to say, because, again, what brings one person around is not going to be the same thing that brings another person around. And, so you really just need this to be coming in so many different ways. And it takes, work on and I think, PETA is a great example of this to me. And this is one of the many reasons why I've, been so grateful to be able to be part of the organization, is that, there is an appreciation for the fact that there are so many different approaches that are needed. And so if you look at PETA, there's, there's work done on, things like legislation, and that level. But then there's also this understanding that if we want to see change in the world we're living in right now, there needs to be cultural change. There needs to be, I think so much of what we do is changing the way people think and the way they think and the way they act, that their habits, their ideas, literally changing the way, in our case, the way people think about animals. Because if you can change that thought, again, truly change it, not just, but I mean, really, truly change it on a level that creates a shift, then they'll change their behaviors. And then that behavior will change, will change business, will change government, will change, the world around us.
The ripples go out. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, so I think that, again, so much of what we do is finding, how do you change the culture and how do you change cultural thought? Whether, obviously for us, that can mean everything from, staging the kind of demonstration that people just literally cannot walk past and look away from, or, that we know will make headlines through the media and will reach people, reaching people where they are is a big part of it. I think not everyone's going to come looking for this information. So you kind of have to make it reach them sometimes. And so, that's where that focus on the media, whether it's through, these really eye-catching demonstrations or through celebrity campaigns or obviously through social media. Social media has really changed the game of how these, of how activists work, and obviously, being able to take the kind of footage that we get from undercover investigations, for instance, or, whistleblowers, and to just put that directly out to the world without having to wait for a media outlet to pick it up. I mean, that's, that in and of itself is a huge shift. So yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And then obviously there's also the other side of, I always say you can't give problems without solutions. If you just give people, the problems, they get overwhelmed and they shut down, and they, you have to say, okay, here's the problem and here's the action step. So, if, for us, if the problem we're presenting is, look at how we abuse animals, on factory farms and slaughterhouses and laboratories, then, obviously the part of the solution to that is, like, you personally can stop supporting this by going vegan. And then also the step of, like, and here are the many, many ways that you can do that in a way that's compatible with your life. And so these days that, we work with an incredible array of companies, getting them to put vegan options on their menus, so that as a vegan, you can go to the local health food store, but these days, like, for instance, if you're in the UK, you can go to Burger King, and, get a vegan option. I mean, and again, like, your average vegan might not be going to Burger King, but it's about meeting people where they are and having these options where they are. Or, we work with all kinds of companies that that make products that you can just buy at your local pharmacy, and work with them on ending animal testing and making their brands cruelty free. Or
that's one thing that's really clear from talking to you and from when I interviewed Ingrid as well, is this sense of we've sort of got to pull all the levers because we don't really know which is going to work. There's also this sense of, as you say, it's not enough to be preaching to the choir. We've got to be able to get out there to people who wouldn't necessarily be receptive to the message and may not hear it. That also leads to, massive diversity of different things that are going on, like you say, from lobbying campaigns and corporate campaigns to street outreach and demonstrations as well. Now, in that diversity of different things that PETA does, there's going to be some stuff that annoys people. PETA is, not shy about,
no.
We're going to do it anyway. But what do you think about some of those challenges? Because, some of my previous guests have talked about this issue or these issues. What one is the challenge you'll get from some schools of feminism about the way that women are involved in some of your protests. There's another general challenge about the scale of, NGOs and charities that have become very big and somewhat corporatized, and there's funding requirements versus sort of more grassroots organic activism and so on. What do you think about those sorts of challenges to the way PETA operates?
Well, I think I always appreciate the opportunity to talk about the idea of PETA somehow being at odds with feminism, because that comes, that's something that gets kind of thrown out there a lot. I am absolutely a feminist. And, we were talking about the punk scene before. Riot Girl is how I entered the punk scene. And for anyone who wasn't around back then in the 90s or doesn't know, I mean, that was, the feminist punk scene. That was actually how I came into that. Actually, it was after, a lot of it was after leaving that school I was talking about, where I didn't mention, but, part of their philosophy, it was very sexist, very women are inferior, and
so yet more fuel for you kicking back in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that kind of infuriated me into this space where I was in this feminist punk scene, and that's just, I've always considered myself, a feminist, and I've also been on the front lines of many of these PETA campaigns that involve being, out at a protest in body paint or, naked with fake blood all over you. When the thing is, to me, so much of feminism is about just respecting people's autonomy to make their own decisions, to make their own decisions about their bodies and their lives. And of course, that's something that humans constantly deny animals. We take away their ability to make the most basic decisions about their lives, their bodies. We take their bodies. We use their bodies. We use their reproductive systems in ways that are, so if someone had shown me that, when I was younger, it would have been all over. That's all I would have needed to see. The fact that we forcefully inseminate animals, impregnate animals, take their babies. I mean, it's so at odds with feminism. And so then to me, the idea of the fact that I have absolute autonomy over my body, my decisions, if I choose to take part in a protest that whatever, with my clothes off or something, that's entirely my decision. And I'm standing up for animals who never have a decision about what happens to their bodies.
Yeah, completely. And I can't, I don't want to speak for these people. I think the people who make those criticisms would, in a sense, they would recognize that because they're feminists too. And they say you can and should do absolutely what the hell you like without question. I guess they're more worried about the second order impact of whether there's some objectification that's being normalized or whether there might be another impact on wider society that we need to think about. I don't think they're necessarily suggesting that you shouldn't do what the hell you want, but yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm also just describing to me some of the philosophy behind it. There's a certain meaning to me of actually bodily putting myself out there for animals who have no choices about their bodies.
That's part of the meaning of the act. To
me, it is, to provoke that conversation. But, speaking to the other, part of what you mentioned, I mean, there are a couple of things there. First of all, being at PETA, it's a very interesting study in society and media, because I have to say, people always say, oh, PETA, naked women. PETA's done so many advertisements with naked men, so many demonstrations with naked men. I can't tell you how many protests I've done, myself standing, unclothed next with men who also aren't wearing clothes, or that I organize with other people that involve men and women, both of them in the same state of being undressed.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how often the media will take a photo of that protest and crop out the men, and just put the photo of the woman. And, and so that's always interesting to me. So often I think it's about what the media chooses to cover or what people choose to notice or share on social media, et cetera. Because I can tell you that we're certainly, we certainly work with all genders alike and, in all different ways. But what ends up getting the most attention is out of our hands. So there's that. And then I would also say, in terms of, I think that if you look at some of our ads that are kind of like sexy in a traditional sense, maybe. The thing is, again, that's part of, advertising that is sexy in a traditional sense is coming to people from all of these, it's like the fast food companies and the, all these businesses that exploit animals are marketing to people in this way that, for better or worse, appeals to them through, this kind of imagery. And so I think it's very subversive that we take this imagery and we use it to, it's like to unmarket to them. We use it to actually tear down this facade and say, like, we grab their attention with something that they are accustomed to responding to. But then we say, okay, and now that we have your attention, we're going to debunk what you've been told by the establishment.
Anti-marketing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, again, it's meeting people where they are, and it's making use of things that people already respond to. And that is what some people need. Some people need to be reached in a way that looks like something they're already comfortable with, that they're already familiar with. And then other people need something that's just going to be, come at them, in a totally different way. And we do that too, but I think it takes everything, because, we're individuals, everyone's different, and everyone's going to respond to something different.
Yeah. And these are deeply embedded systemic problems. And we need to pull all the levers at once. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Did you want to spend a bit of time drilling into the Dress Vegan campaign? And again, I'll let you decide how much more of your time I should take up, because I love the idea of it in a sense, in that it's, one of the very annoying things as a vegan on Twitter, of course, is people thinking that veganism is a diet. So it's really interesting to talk about something that clearly isn't food. So. Right.
Yeah. And the thing is, I'm sure that a lot of people, who subscribe to this podcast, I'm sure a lot of them already have some understanding of that. But I think, but I will say, I think, so I feel like for most of us, food is probably where we start. I remember, again, it was one of those moments where, suddenly it was like when I first went vegetarian, someone was like, what about your shoes? And I was like, oh, all right. Okay, there's more to this. And again, there was a lot less information back then, and you had to go to greater lengths to seek it out. And you had to probably go to greater lengths to seek out products. And a wonderful thing these days, and something that, PETA works very hard at, is the fact that there are so many accidentally vegan or already vegan clothing options out there. But now there are also all of these companies that realize that there's a demand for this, animal-free fashion. And that's being produced by specifically vegan companies, and then also by these bigger brands that, that have realized, like, that people want, for instance, down alternative jackets, or that people want vegan leather shoes. And I think that's a great example of the fact that, a lot of the smaller vegan brands are, generally doing this because, they have some ethical, motivation there somewhere. When you see these bigger brands doing it, these, like the big sneaker companies, they're not making vegan sneakers to be nice. They're doing it because there's a demand for it, and they're filling that demand. And I think I always just, I think it's so important to realize that, so that people realize that their individual actions and choices do matter. It's not like there's this big world just functioning independently of you and your choices. Like the fact that these vegan options are being made by these big companies, whether you're talking about food or fashion or, cruelty-free products, it's not happening because they want to be nice. It's happening because people demanded it, asked for it, bought it, supported it, so, that's just, I think it's empowering to kind of like think about that, whether, when we're making choices about what we eat, what we wear, et cetera, that, our individual choices do end up having a greater impact. But so,
And that's one of the things I get frustrated with. I mean, there are some formal philosophical arguments around it, but it's either an argument from futility, there's no point, this thing's so big, or the argument from ineffectiveness that says, look, there's a massive system, I'm a tiny cog in a wheel, it doesn't really make any difference. And my response to it in a couple of ways is, one, even if you only make a small impact, that's still a real impact, right? So it counts. The second thing is that as you were saying before, the ripples from each individual decision go much further than we might think. And it's not just about, boycotting a particular product or buying a good product. It's also the marketing signal that sends, but it's also friends and family seeing that, and the echoes that can come from that, and even policy implications that can come from it.
Totally.
And it's also, if you flipped it around and said, well, if you imagine that you were, you'd been donating to a charity for 10 years, and so had 1 million other people, and then an investigation uncovered it was actually funding terrorism, you wouldn't say, well, 1 million other people are still donating, so I'm going to keep going because my donation makes no difference, right? If you're funding a terrible system unnecessarily, then stop. Right?
That's a fabulous way to put it. That's such a good way.
Almost regardless of if you're only a tiny cog in a big machine. I mean, who cares? The same argument would lead you to not bother voting or do anything. I mean, just give up, right? Just give up. And I
mean, you know what? The status quo, the system, it wants you to believe that you are powerless.
Absolutely.
That it wants you to believe that your individual actions don't matter, and they do. And I think this actually goes back to what we were discussing about how you make a better world. You put more stock in your individual ability to make a difference. You feel empowered by, and again, that can be, these things of what you eat, what you wear. It can also be, again, I live in New York City. I can't tell you how often I come across, sort of like urban wildlife in need, whether you're talking about like an injured pigeon or, a squirrel, whatever. Just these animals who live in the city who somehow, they get sick, they get injured. And so often you'll see people, they clearly care, and they'll kind of be like clustering around and looking, and they don't know what to do, and they want to help. And I remember when I first moved here and I first had an encounter like that, feeling very petrified, paralyzed. And I, thankfully, PETA has a 24-hour hotline that, you can call for help with animal emergencies. And so I was able to do that and kind of be guided through it. But over the years, I basically realized that you deal with these things by you just dive in, you get your hands dirty. It's funny because I think that it's not so often that people don't care when they see something with an animal or otherwise, when they see something wrong going on. I don't necessarily think that they don't act because they don't care. I think it's almost that they don't realize that they have the agency to act. They realize it's like they almost are waiting for someone to give them permission. And so I can't tell you how many times I've seen like an injured bird on the sidewalk, and I just go in and, and pick them up or catch them or do whatever. And everyone kind of looks like, wait, you're how to do that? You can, but it's just, yes, you're allowed. And this is again on that individual level, and it's also on the bigger level. You're allowed to speak up when you see something wrong happening. You're allowed to, it's you don't have to wait for anyone to give you permission to do the right thing and to act and to change things. You just dive in and do it.
I love it.
Yeah.
And one thing is for sure is if everybody sits at home waiting for collective action and systemic change to solve the problem, there's not going to be any collective action or systemic change, right?
No,
it's just there's nobody else who's going to do it. So just, like you say, I love it. Just dive in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just act.
I mean, maybe that is a brilliant inspirational message, maybe for us to close up on.
I think so. I think because that it's the problem and the solution. The solution is you act.
Yeah. Super simple. Well, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I could have talked to you all day, but I should really let you get on with the rest of
this has been lovely. Thank you so much.
Your working day. Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and I think we put the world to rights. What's real, what and who matters, and how to fix everything. It's pretty simple. We just need to get on with it now.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I think we solved it. We got a visit from Princess Niche, to tell us we were on the right track.
Exactly. We're done. So what's the best way of people following you, learning more about your campaigns, staying in touch personally for your own social media, but also the PETA work you do? I'll include links in the show notes, of course.
Right. Well, so people can follow PETA. There's our website, PETA.org, and our social media. We have all of it, of course, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, just at PETA. And then, and I always say, PETA is such an amazing resource. So for anyone who does have questions, anything they're trying to figure out, if it's not on the website, you can email PETA and you will get a response. So I think that's a pretty wonderful, resource for people who are trying to, figure things out in any direction when it comes to being better for animals.
And the number of my guests who said the turning point for them was actually PETA literature, whether it was a website or activism, or with some of them from a certain generation, just the leaflets, right? So
yeah. I love that. I hear it a lot too, and it's really it's amazing to get to be part of that, because it definitely meant a lot to me over the years as I was learning as well.
And how about individually? Are you much of a social media person personally, or?
Yeah. People can follow me on Instagram, on Twitter. My handle is Ash Loves Mongo, which we were talking about before. Mongo is my former dog before Pogue, and both of them are wonderful, beautiful soulmates. But yeah, so it's Ash Loves Mongo.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Well, thank you again. It's been a genuine inspiration. Like I say, people just need to decide to act and dive right in. Yeah. But
thank you so much. This has been a great conversation, and I love that you're having this conversation with so many different people and different perspectives. It's just,
I love it. Well, they're the most important questions. So until everybody's got the answers right, I'm going to just keep pushing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being a guest on Sentientist Conversations, Ashley. Please stay in touch.
Thank you. I will. Thank you.